Hello and welcome to Indie Designer Journal episode 21. Today we're going to be looking at the tabletop role-playing game called Fallen. I got a copy here. Alan from Perplexing Ruins was kind enough to send me a copy. I also have some really interesting, I guess they're like a prompt type card. We're going to go look at a few of these. When we get to we're going to turn the camera around in a few minutes and take a look at some of the stuff. Also got this cool Oracle sheet that has a bunch of instructions and different things you can do on the back, creating NPC characters and things of that nature. But on the front, you can roll some dice to help you with some, just gives you a word, a sort of a prompt system. I think it's fascinating if you're a writer. I think it's cool if you're stuck in the game design, you're looking for some sort of direction. And especially, obviously, if you're going to be a game master for a tabletop role-playing game, having two tools like this, I think can really help you out. He also sent along this book called Hill Grab. It's a supplement to the base game. You don't need this to play the game, but it gives you a cool city that you get to explore. We'll look really quickly at this. We're going to spend most of our time when we turn this camera around looking at the actual base game. Now you're probably wondering, wait a second, Jason, you design board games. What are you looking at these tabletop role-playing games for? There's a lot of crossover, as you know. There's more and more we're seeing games that are utilizing mechanics that are found in Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games. And I think there's obviously, if you're a fan of one, you're typically a fan of the other. There's a lot of crossover there. But more importantly, if you're a designer, I think it's imperative that you look outside of just the board gaming world for ideas. So by getting books, like I've kind of went on a rampage recently, purchasing all sorts of books. Really quickly, I got this really cool book called Book of Random Tables. So what is it full of? You bet, it's full of random tables. So items in a wizard's chamber. Roll 100-sided dice. Let's see what's in there. So it's full of everything you could possibly think of. Really cool book. I'm going to be utilizing this along with a couple other resources that are found inside this Fallen book to create a world that I'm going to be building to, because I want to GM a game. I'm going to play with my daughter Abby that you saw in episode 19 and her boyfriend. So I want to build a world, but instead of coming up with this story and just creating it from scratch myself, I'm going to be using some of these tools to create that world. And I think that's fascinating. But more importantly, if you're a board game designer or you're just interested in design in general, there's some mechanics that are being implemented in this game, Fallen, that I think are unique. I haven't seen them before. Some are spins on things that I have seen, but there's a few things in here that I think are quite fascinating, and I think if you're into game design, you'll find them fascinating as well. And that's why I'm going to start sprinkling in some strange, different things outside of the realm of board games in the Indie Designer Journal. I also picked up this giant book. I didn't know it was going to be this big. I got Dungeon Crawl Classics, mainly because I've seen so much supplements for this that attracted my eye. I wanted to get myself familiar with the game itself. It seems to be based off of early Dungeons and Dragons. I have a few other OSR books already. I have a Labyrinth Lord and Basic Fantasy and a few others that I've had for years. I've read through those. But I've been recently getting very interested in these smaller things. I have the Four Against Darkness, which I think I showed you before, but I haven't done a video on it. I have D100 Dungeon, which is amazing. It's one of both of those are kind of right on the middle in my mind. They're almost a board game, and they're also a tabletop role-playing experience at the same time. So that's why I think that both genres sort of are blended. I also picked up a Micro Chapbook RPG. I got a problem. I'm telling you right now, I got a problem. I can't stop buying these things. I picked up Sacrifice off of a recommendation. I flipped through this the other night. This looks like a really awesome little, it's 80 pages or so, about 80 pages, little RPG. Really cool theme. I picked up White Box. I think this was only like $6. on Amazon. It's very similar to Labyrinth Lord that I have, but it's even more condensed and small. Look how small this is, and it's basically looks like first edition D&D from what I can see going through this, probably with upgraded, some modern mechanics, but really cool stuff. Hopefully we'll have videos on this stuff moving forward as I familiarize myself with it more. But today our focus is on Fallen, which I've fallen in love for. Sorry. But yes, it's really cool. It's not fantasy. It takes place in the 16th through 18th century, I believe. So there's early crude pistols, and it reminds me of what Darkest Dungeon, the role-playing game, could be. And it's very simple rules that leaves some interpretation to the player and the game master, and I think it's just a really nice balance in that regard, where it's not overly crunchy and it leaves a lot of room for you to kind of make decisions for yourself. Plus, if you're into solo gaming, which I am, obviously I did most of my games are solo, there's enough in this little book, I think it's $10, to help guide you in solo play. So it's not specifically spelled out for you, but I think there's enough information, charts and whatnot, that you could really have a good time playing this solo. In fact, if you search around YouTube, there are other channels that have done just that, and you can watch some playthroughs, which I have, and they're fascinating and fun to watch. Very imaginative people out there coming up with some cool ideas. So without any further ado, let's turn this camera around and take a look at Fallen. Thanks for joining me at the table. Alan from Perplexing Ruins sent me a copy of Fallen and some extra goodies for it, and I wanted to go over this stuff quickly so we can move on to the core book. There's 5 or 6 interesting mechanics in here that I think will appeal to designers, whether you design board games, card games, or tabletop role-playing games. Some interesting things in there. So these 2 items here that he sent me are what I would consider prompts. He calls this an oracle. You basically roll a D66, which means you roll 2 6-sided dice. One is a tens place, one is a ones place. And this is for if you're looking for prompts to help direct your story, whether you're playing solo or if you might be the game master in the game. I believe they call it a spinner in this game. So this would be 32. And 32 is protection. So maybe there's some sort of aura of protection in this location. Maybe you're in some ruins, or maybe you're in some forest. Maybe you want more information. You can roll again. I got a 24, and it says murder. So that really can spark some sort of narrative for you. So this is really good if you're trying to be creative, come up with some story. And the same can be said and there's a lot of information on the back here too. You can roll and check a bunch of different types of check. Like you can make a really quick NPC back here, and there's all sorts of interesting things that I'll let you discover. There will be a link in the description to all of this content. I believe all of it is still available. And yeah, you can check those out for yourself. I really highly recommend you taking a look at this game. So this deck here, I think it's about 20 cards. It works in a similar fashion. So if there's a little yes or no prompt here, so you can shuffle these up, draw one. Okay, the answer to whatever question is yes. There's a no in here. There might be even a maybe. There's like a no but and a yes but and things like that. Yes and there's also all sorts of little trigger words on here too that works very similar to the other card that we just looked at, like cemetery, revelation, seeker, monster. So if you can just draw this up. If you're trying to build a location or maybe a village, you can draw maybe 3 of these cards and try to come up with some sort of story. And I think that's really kind of fun to help you as a creator. Now this, like I said, can be helpful. That doesn't really matter what you're designing. Even if maybe you're just a writer, something like this could be very useful. And I've been messing around with it quite a bit myself. This is a supplement. We're not going to get too much into this. Maybe I'll look at this deeper in a future episode, but basically this is a supplement for the core book. It goes over the city of Hillgrove, which is, I'll show you this cool map that's in the first page here, of the city, and there's all different locations. There's the dens, there's the Risen Rook Hill, there's the dockings, and then for each one of those locations, there's a whole couple of pages on it with characters that are important in that area, different things that are their establishments, and things like along those lines. So basically, it gives you a really cool city that you can adventure in. There's all sorts of other additional mechanics for the game, but since we haven't talked about the core game yet, I don't want to get too much into this book other than to say it is how many pages is it? Probably about 40 pages. Yeah, 43 pages. Beautiful artwork, very well laid out, all sorts of charts and things you can roll on to figure out different things. Like you could figure if you want to build a character, some sort of character in a town, you can roll a 12-sided dice and these different charts to kind of build an endless number of types of characters, and that's really good for solo play, but it's also really good if you're designing a game, you're trying to come up with characters for a game. Having something like this is pretty cool to have. So we'll look at this, I think, in a future episode, maybe once I've actually went through it a little bit more. I haven't read it completely. I have read this completely and watched plenty of videos on it, so I'm pretty excited about this. I plan on building my own little world using some of these charts and stuff in my next episode. So the next episode of Indie Designer Journal, we will be building a world for this game, and so I can make a campaign. I'm gonna play with my daughter Abby that you saw in episode 19. Her and her boyfriend seem to be interested in playing some Dungeons and Dragons, so I feel this might be actually a good starting point for them. I haven't played a tabletop role-playing game in quite some time, but I used to actually love designing them back in the day. I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons and Warhammer Fantasy role-play, so this really kind of feels like that sort of era of game, more like the Warhammer Fantasy role-play, because this is not medieval. This takes place in the 16th through 18th century. There are guns, blunderbusses, and very crude pistols, things of that nature, but there's still lots of swords and things of that. It's a really kind of a cool era. It kind of reminds me a lot of Darkest Dungeon. There's a nice little forward here that basically tells you the time period the game takes place in. Also tells you that this game is not mechanically heavy, meaning that every decision and choice and things, you can't just roll a dice. There's not like 100% certainty. There's a little bit of looseness to the game, and it kind of pushes you to use narrative to come up with solutions as the person running the game. You have to keep that in mind, that this game is not going to have all the answers like a Dungeons and Dragons manual. So let's go through this. It's a good balance, I think, personally, especially for someone who's getting new to tabletop role-playing games. I'd like to talk, like I said, about 5 or 6 things in this book, PowerPoint or points of interest to me that I think will be interesting to other people. You have these abilities like any good dungeon crawl or role-playing game. You have strength, focus, agility, will. They all do different things. In the beginning of a game, you're going to allocate points to them. You can have 3 points in one of them, 2 points in one of them, 1 point in one of them, and one of them gets 0, and you indicate that with some dice. So you get 3 dice. So let's say we want a character who has good agility. Let's say he has a will of 1 and he has a strength of 2. So that would be our character. And how do you do checks in this game, or how do you determine if you're successful at something, is simply done by rolling 2 6-sided dice and adding up the results. I picked not the best dice because they're probably difficult to see, but I rolled a 5 and a 3 for a total of 8. Now, if this is an ability check, I would add whatever ability I was using. So let's say it was a strength check, so I had 8 plus the 2 is 10. So what do the dice say? Well, what do the dice say? On a 10 or higher, it's a success. On a 7 or 9, it's a complication, which is left sort of up to interpretation of the game master to determine what exactly happens. Maybe you get harmed trying to lift something, whatever the check was for, and that can lead to a lot of cool narration, and it can be very interesting. So on a 6 or less, it's a fail. We've seen systems like this before. It's a roll over. system, and I think it works very well. But what's interesting about this game is at any point you can decide to use luck, and what luck means is you pull a dice from one of these abilities, and you get to add it to your dice pool. You roll all those dice and try to see if you can get 10 or higher. It's a kind of a pressure luck thing in the sense that if you fail, whether you are successful or you fail, this dice is now gone until you rest and you can get that ability to get that dice back. So I think that's a really cool way. You can literally use all three of these dice, if I'm not mistaken, and add them to your dice pool and roll all your dice so you know you're going to succeed at something, but then you're not going to be able to use those. And not only are you not going to be able to use them again in your dice pool, you lose that bonus to your whatever ability that you're checking against. So let's just say I used this one, it's gone now. Later on, if I have to do a strength check, I don't get that 2 anymore until I rest. I think that's an amazing little system that allows you to kind of mitigate dice. If you know it's something you really want to be successful at, you have the opportunity to do that. So let's move on. Combat has a very interesting thing. Combat works in the same way. You're rolling 2 dice and you're trying to see if you get a 10 or higher to be successful. You get to add strength. If it's a melee attack, you get to add your focus if it is a ranged attack. Now what's interesting is your health is not tracked in like hit points like most games. You don't just start with 12 or 20 hit points. You start at a rank, and you always start at rank 6, which means you have 6. You put your dice on the side that indicates 6, and you can take 2 different types of damage. You can take harm. Harm is lesser, and it basically just moves you down to pip. So now you get hit for 1 harm, you go down to 5, you go down to 4, you go down to 3. And once you run out on this dice, you go to the next lowest dice, which would be a 4-sided dice, and you start at 4, and then you can start working your way down. And if you ever get to 0, you have to do a will check or you die. I think that's pretty fascinating. And what's fascinating about it is there's another type of damage you can take, and it is called a wound. If you take a wound, you just go down a rank immediately. So you just lose from this, you go all the way down to a 4-sided dice, you get another wound, you're dead unless you successfully do a will check. Fascinating system. This also obviously works when you're attacking your enemies. Same thing for them. If you can do the same types of damage to them, they have ranks. So a tough enemy might have a rank of 10, which means they start with a 10-sided dice. You'd have to do 1 wound to get them to an 8-sided dice, and then another wound to get them to a 6-sided dice, and then another wound to get to a 4. So you have to get 4 successful wounds on them to kill them. Not very easily done. So I think that's a very interesting combat system. It's very simple, easy to explain. Let's move on to usage dice. We'll go quickly over this. Consumables, sort of a finicky sort of thing in games, and I found this interesting how he dealt with this. Instead of having keeping track of every single torch you have, every single ration you have, or lock picks or things of that nature, all those types of items have a little UD, which means they're controlled by a usage dice. And you start off with a 20-sided dice. Whenever you move from a location to location, or perhaps you do something that would require you to use one of these items, you're going to be asked to roll this dice. If you roll a 1 or a 2, it moves down. If you roll anything else, it remains. So this game is it's not meant to be a punishing game. It's meant to be a game where you're pushed through a story. So there's no need to really control or be a micromanage all these little tiny details. So it's very nice that on a 20-sided dice, rolling 1 or 2 is very difficult to do. But if you do, you move down to a 12-sided dice, and then next time you're asked to do the check, you roll the dice again. If you get a 1 or a 2, you move down to a 10, so forth, so on. And if you ever run out, then you're considered to not have access to any of these consumable items unless you go to a shop or some other story element that allows you to replenish that dice. I think it's just a simple way of kind of adding some tension and panic to the player, especially if you're in a long adventure and you're not going to have access to shops or anything like that. But instead of making you check off everything, or you move this many feet, check off a torch or something like that. I thought that was very interesting and unique. I've never seen that before. Let's quickly move on to, I want to talk about fear. I don't have it on my notes, but there is a fear system in here. When you start the game, you make your character, you roll on this little chart here to see places that bring you peace and it will help you recover from fear, and there's places that actually give you fear. So what is fear? It's a token, so you have to come up with some sort of token or write it on your character sheet. But when you have fear, whenever you do any sort of test requiring you to roll 2d6, you have to subtract the number of fear tokens that you have. So as your fear builds, you just become worse at basically everything. I thought that was fascinating, very simple way of dealing with that. There's special mechanics for dueling and firearms. We won't get into that. Interesting, you have skills in this game like most games. So when you're doing a skill check, you don't usually add any ability to it. You just do a basic skill check and you add whatever skill that might be checked if you have skill points in it. So in the beginning, you get to allocate 5 points to these different skills. There's not that many. There's about a dozen different skills that you can add points to. You can add 5 total, 4 max in any sort of skill. So you can only have a maximum of 4 diplomacy. I wouldn't recommend. I think putting all 4 into one, maybe the only one I would say that might be good for doing is incantations, because we're going to talk about that next. Incantations, fascinating system for dealing with magic. Now, instead of having a huge glossary of spells like any Dungeons and Dragons book would have, instead you have this really unique system over here where you're going to basically pull dice. So let's say you had 4, you put 4 skill points into, let's just say 2, make it simple. Say you put 2 skill points in incantation, so you'd have 2 dice. Let's say you put, and there's 2 different types of magic. You have dark, which does harm, and you have light, which does healing. So let's say our character, we decided in the beginning of the game we're going to put 1 point in light and 1 point in dark, and we're in a situation we want to cast a spell. We would get 2 dice. One would be a dice for your light, one would be your dice for your dark. We'll say the black is for the dark, and we will roll those, and you need to get to 10 or higher. So it works the same as any other check in the game. So if you don't get a 10 or higher, your incantation is going to fail. So in this situation, we would have failed, which means we would have gotten a curse. But let's just say we rolled let's say we had 3 dice instead, or maybe we used one of our dice from one of our abilities for luck, and we're going to lose that in the future until we rest. But we really want this spell to work, so we roll, and well, we failed again. But let's just say we were successful. I just want to show you how this works quickly, and how it works is you have 4 for light, which means you go to this line here and you look at these 3 words and you kind of choose one. So one says orb, one says field, and one says moss. And then the 5 told us deplete, lightning, and blood. So we get to build or create whatever this might be. So we'll be using these words as the player. We come up with an idea of what we want to do with these abilities that surface from this dice roll. So maybe we have an orb of lightning that's going to protect us. So we create some sort of protective spell. Of course, the GM / singer or whatever I keep forgetting the name of the GM and they get in this game, but he'll decide or she'll decide if that works or not, or if they'll allow it or not, but likely yes, because that's how this game's built to be fun. So yes, I was able to build an orb of lightning. Pretty cool. You get to just put 2 words together and come with all sorts of things. I saw in another video, the one that was done by the Dungeon Dive, he got explode and bones. How cool is that? Just make your enemy's bones explode. And I think it's just a fun way to dealing with, and of course there's healing things and summoning and stuff like that, but I think it's a really fun way of handling magic. I've never seen anything like that before, and I wanted to bring it up. There's a way to do advancement. We won't get into that. It's very unique and different, but I like, and we'll talk about it maybe in a future episode, or when we get into actual gameplay in the future, in a future episode. Exploration uses a node system, so you're basically moving along some sort of path, and every time you move, you have to do a travel. You have to check your skill of venture it is, and I want to make sure I got it right. Venture and when you get to the location, you use your exploration. So you venture and then you explore, and through that process, you could potentially lose some of your consumable items and things of that nature. And then there's tons of generators, and this is why this is great for solo. So you can have different generators in the wild, different generators in the city. You have themes, you have things you might find in the nature, things in rooms, details about the rooms. Maybe there's mildew or there's a smell. Things. It's really cool that you can just utilize these charts and really come up with some interesting narratives and NPCs, people you can hire. All sorts of stuff, all sorts of words here that are just nouns, random nouns that you can roll on and come up with some ideas. As you can see, there's a lot of adjectives, verbs, and then you get into some information about different artifacts and treasures and trinkets that you can basically treasures for the game. The last thing I want to touch on really quickly is there's a really good bestiary in this for an indie game. There is, I don't know how many, 20 or so enemies in here. Very unique, creepy stuff, dark and foreboding, and they all have something in here called menace. Some of them have it, some of them don't, and menace is something that you can get that gains your character renown, that you can utilize to help your dice rolls in particular towns. So maybe the town's being haunted by a certain enemy and you destroy it, and now you have favor in that town. So whenever you're doing things in that particular area or town or whatnot, you're going to get better dice rolls. It's very open to interpretation, which is I like. And I think this is a fantastic game. Like I said, I'll have a link for it in the description. And I thank you very much for stopping by and watching this video. Hopefully you got some cool ideas for a design of your own. Until next time, take care.